Chapter 1. The Climate of the Mind. The present moment receives whatever the mind carries into it. It does not discriminate. It does not correct. It does not soften what arrives. It simply holds it. This is why two people can stand in the same room, perform the same task, and experience entirely different realities. The difference is not the moment itself, but the internal atmosphere through which the moment is perceived. That atmosphere is rarely neutral. Long before a task begins, the mind has already tilted the field. Expectations lean forward. Residue from earlier hours settles quietly. A tone forms, subtle, often unnamed, that determines how effort will feel. The body sits down to work, but the mind arrives with momentum from elsewhere, and unless that momentum is noticed, it becomes indistinguishable from the work itself. This is what is meant by the climate of the mind. It is not emotion in its obvious form. It is not anger flaring or joy rising. It is the quieter layer beneath those expressions, the background pressure, the sense of openness or contraction, the degree to which attention feels available or strained. This climate shapes perception before conscious thought intervenes. It alters scale. It changes what feels urgent and what feels manageable. It decides, often silently, how much resistance will be encountered before the first action is taken. A task does not need to be difficult to feel difficult. It only needs to be encountered through a heavy atmosphere. The mind is particularly skilled at mistaking internal weather for external reality. A slight tension becomes a signal that something is wrong. A vague reluctance becomes evidence that the task lacks meaning. A moment of uncertainty becomes a warning about capability. These interpretations feel reasonable because they arise automatically, without argument. The climate speaks, and perception listens. Once this fusion occurs, effort becomes distorted. The worker no longer engages the task directly. They engage the emotional response to the task. Energy is spent managing sensation rather than meeting requirement. Attention divides. Progress slows. The day begins to feel more demanding than it objectively is. What makes this so difficult to correct is that the mind rarely recognizes its own influence. It does not say, "I am carrying tension and therefore this feels heavier." It says, "This is heavy." The climate is not experienced as climate. It is experienced as truth. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Emotional resistance delays action. Delay amplifies apprehension. Apprehension increases resistance. The task grows larger in imagination than it ever was in reality. Eventually, the worker feels drained without having done anything proportionate to the fatigue they experience. The exhaustion feels mysterious, unearned, and unfair. In truth, it is the exhaustion of internal friction. Much of modern work is not physically demanding. It is cognitively and emotionally demanding. The body remains capable, but the mind is strained by constant interpretation. Each moment is assessed, evaluated, and narrated before it is lived. The present becomes crowded with commentary, and commentary consumes energy. This is why emotional turbulence does not merely accompany work, it competes with it. When attention is divided between what must be done and how it feels to be doing it, the mind is effectively doing two jobs at once. One job moves the task forward, the other reacts to the task's imagined implications. The second job rarely produces anything useful, but it consumes enormous bandwidth. The result is effort that feels disproportionate to output. This imbalance is often mistaken for a character flaw. People describe themselves as undisciplined, unmotivated, or incapable of focus. But these labels miss the underlying mechanism. The issue is not a lack of drive. It is a lack of separation between emotional climate and objective requirement. The climate of the mind is shaped by countless influences that have nothing to do with the task at hand. Sleep, hunger, memory, anticipation, unresolved tension, all of these drift into the present moment unnoticed. Once there, they attach themselves to whatever is encountered next. The task becomes the container for emotion that originated elsewhere. This is why the same work can feel radically different at different times. The task is constant, the climate is not. Without awareness, the worker assumes the task has changed. They conclude that the work is inherently inconsistent, that motivation is unreliable, that progress depends on finding the right internal state. They wait for clarity before acting. They wait for confidence. They wait for energy. In doing so, they grant emotional climate veto power over effort. This is where productivity becomes fragile. The present moment does not require ideal conditions, it requires contact. But contact feels difficult when the mind is negotiating with its own atmosphere. A person can be fully present and still resist what is happening if emotional climate has already framed the moment as undesirable or threatening. Understanding this distinction changes the nature of discipline. Discipline is not forcing oneself to act against emotion. It is recognizing that emotion is not the authority it claims to be. It is learning to see the climate clearly enough that it no longer dictates perception. Once the climate is recognized as climate, its influence weakens. A feeling of heaviness becomes something that exists alongside the task, not something that defines it. A sense of resistance becomes an internal condition, not a verdict on the value or feasibility of the work. The present moment regains its shape. This recognition does not eliminate discomfort, it removes confusion. The worker who understands their internal climate stops asking whether they feel like doing the work and starts noticing what the work actually requires. Attention shifts from interpretation to engagement. The task becomes concrete again. It has edges, it has boundaries. It no longer expands to fill the imagination. This is the first real relief. When emotional climate loses its authority, effort becomes simpler, not easier, but simpler. There is less internal debate, less rehearsal, less justification. Action follows more directly from intention. The mind spends less time arguing with itself and more time meeting the moment. Over time, this produces a noticeable stability. Output becomes more consistent. The highs are less euphoric, the lows less catastrophic. The worker is no longer hostage to mood. They operate within the present moment regardless of atmospheric conditions. This does not mean the climate disappears. Weather still passes through. But the worker no longer mistakes it for the terrain. They no longer assume that what they feel is what the moment is. This distinction between climate and landscape is the foundation of unemotional work. Before attention can be trained further, before rhythm and continuity can be built, before effort can compound reliably, this separation must be established. Without it, every technique collapses under emotional pressure. With it, even difficult days remain usable. The second half of this chapter will examine how this separation is cultivated, how the mind learns to observe its own atmosphere without becoming entangled in it, and how presence becomes steadier when emotion is no longer confused with reality. For now, it is enough to see the climate for what it is: a condition, not a command. Once the climate of the mind is recognized, something unexpected happens. The urge to fix it weakens. Most people assume that awareness must be immediately followed by correction. If heaviness is noticed, they try to lighten it. If resistance is felt, they attempt to remove it. If anxiety arises, they search for calm. But this reflex misunderstands the nature of inner weather. Climate does not respond well to force. It responds to orientation. The mind becomes turbulent not because emotion appears, but because emotion is treated as a problem to be solved before life can proceed. The moment emotion is framed as an obstacle, the present moment is postponed. Action is delayed until the weather improves. This delay grants emotion an authority it does not deserve. The turning point occurs when the worker realizes that emotional climate does not need to be resolved in order for work to continue. It only needs to be acknowledged. Acknowledgement alters the relationship entirely. When a feeling is noticed without judgment, it loses its ability to dominate perception. It no longer is fused with the task. It becomes something occurring within the moment, rather than something defining the moment. The present regains depth. This distinction between what is happening and what is being felt creates space. In that space, effort becomes possible again. The worker who learns to notice the climate begins to experience effort differently. A task no longer carries the emotional weight of the entire day. It becomes what it is, a bounded action requiring a bounded amount of attention. Even when discomfort accompanies it, the discomfort no longer expands to fill the imagination. It remains localized, contained. This containment is crucial. Without it, emotion spreads. A single difficult interaction bleeds into unrelated work. A brief lapse in focus poisons an entire afternoon. A minor setback becomes a verdict on capability. Emotional climate, when uncontained, behaves like ink dropped into water, diffusing until everything is colored by it. Containment does not require suppression, it requires clarity. When the worker sees that emotion is present but not authoritative, the task regains its original proportions. The mind stops inflating difficulty. Energy returns to its proper channel. The worker can engage without waiting for permission from mood. This is not indifference, it is maturity. Maturity in this sense does not mean becoming less sensitive, it means becoming less reactive. It means allowing emotion to exist without allowing it to decide. The inner world becomes something observed rather than something obeyed. As this capacity strengthens, a new rhythm begins to form. Work no longer depends on the emotional quality of the moment, it depends on intention. The worker shows up not because they feel ready, but because readiness is no longer the criterion for action. The present moment is accepted as it is, and engagement begins from there. This shift has a stabilizing effect that extends beyond work. The mind grows quieter, not because emotion disappears, but because fewer arguments are being staged internally. There is less negotiation, less justification, less need to explain to oneself why something should or should not be done. Attention is freed from internal debate. This quiet is not empty, it is functional. In this quieter state, the worker becomes more precise. Decisions are made with less distortion, reactions slow, language becomes more measured. The sense of being rushed diminishes even when demands increase. The climate still changes, but the worker is no longer dragged along by it. Importantly, this stability does not come from controlling emotion. Attempts to control emotion often backfire, intensifying the very sensations they aim to eliminate. Stability comes from reframing emotion's role. Feeling is no longer treated as a command, it becomes information, sometimes useful, sometimes irrelevant, rarely urgent. The present moment becomes simpler under this reframing. Simpler does not mean easy, it means uncluttered. The worker is no longer carrying the emotional residue of yesterday into today's effort, nor are they pre-living tomorrow's difficulties while trying to act now. Attention settles into what is directly in front of them. This settling changes the experience of difficulty itself. Difficulty becomes a feature of the task rather than a commentary on the self. When something is hard, it is hard in a specific way, for a specific reason, and within specific bounds. It is no longer an indictment of intelligence, worth, or destiny. It is simply resistance encountered in real time. This distinction matters more than it appears. When difficulty is interpreted personally, effort becomes defensive. The worker tries to protect identity while performing the task. When difficulty is interpreted impersonally, effort becomes cleaner. The task is met directly, without the added burden of self-evaluation. Progress accelerates not because the task is easier, but because less energy is spent on interpretation. Over time, this approach reshapes identity. The worker begins to see themselves as someone who can operate regardless of internal conditions. Confidence grows quietly, not from positive feeling, but from repeated proof. The mind learns that action is possible even when emotion is unsettled. Trust forms, not in mood, but in capability. This trust becomes a stabilizer. Emotional turbulence still arises, but it no longer threatens the continuity of effort. The worker does not need to feel good to work well. They do not need certainty to act competently. They do not need clarity about the entire future to engage the present moment. They need only to remain oriented. Orientation, in this sense, means knowing where to place attention when the climate shifts. It means returning to the task without demanding that the atmosphere cooperate first. It means allowing emotion to move through the moment without letting it occupy the center of it. This orientation is what separates reactive effort from deliberate work. Reactive effort is always responding to mood, to pressure, to interpretation. Deliberate work responds only to what is required now. It is anchored. It is resilient. By the time this distinction is fully understood, something fundamental has changed. The present moment is no longer feared. It is no longer something to escape or endure. It becomes usable, even when uncomfortable. The worker learns that presence does not demand emotional perfection. It demands attention. This realization closes the chapter where it began, with climate. The climate of the mind will always shift. Weather passes through, storms arise and dissipate. The difference between those who struggle endlessly and those who move steadily forward is not the absence of turbulence, but the refusal to mistake it for the terrain. When the worker learns to see weather as weather, the landscape reappears. The task stands where it always was. Effort becomes possible again, and the present moment, no longer crowded with false authority, becomes the stable ground on which work can finally take place. The next chapter turns toward the stories the mind builds within this climate, how narrative amplifies turbulence, and how clarity is lost not through emotion itself, but through the meanings assigned to it. For now, it is enough to understand this. You are not required to fix the weather in order to walk the path.